It took me a while to get back to the art behind Creating Fire series, and I apologize for that. I attempted to create this video 3 different times now. The first time, one of my cameras stopped working in the middle of recording with no warning. I didn't get a sound, nothing, and I had no idea until I sat down to edit the footage and realized that half of it was gone. The second time was my own fault. I completely forgot to turn on the microphones during the entire recording process. So again, I didn't realize that until I sat down to edit it and had absolutely no sound. At the end of the day, I think this works out better because I'm going to show you my process on an actual job as compared to just on a test panel like what I've done most of the time in the past. I mentioned in one of the previous videos that adaptability is a very important quality to have as an artist. I have changed my process numerous times over the years when it comes to painting fire specifically. Sometimes that's because I've decided to try something new and I like the results better. Maybe it was a different color. Sometimes that's because Createx has come out with a new product, a better product. Sometimes it comes down to the actual project you're working on dictates that you're going to have to do something different. And that was more or less the case on this project. Here's what I was working on. It was the fire department table. Most of the artwork on this table was created with Createx Illustration Sepia. It looks very dark. It almost looks like it could be black. It's not black, it's Illustration Sepia. That includes the background behind the artwork, which is all of that dark area. And I was going for either a smoke effect or maybe even to make it look like it had burned the wood behind the fire. So what specifically made me change my approach for this particular project? If you take a look at the table again, you'll see all of that surrounding area that I created in sepia, the background darkness. I used the sepia to initially kind of map out where I was going to paint or create the fire. On the top half of the image between the firefighters, that area is very dark. I wasn't quite as concerned about that area. It's the lower portion of the artwork surrounding the logo, where the sepia is not quite as dark in all areas and it's not covering a large space. I didn't want to have a halo of just dark sepia completely surrounding the project. The problem with using candies in that lower half of the project is I would wind up with a halo very similar to the lightning video. I wanted to avoid that. So you'll see by the end of this, there's very little candy in the fire on this table. So let's talk about our paint. When it comes to layering the colors of your fire, you can use whatever colors you see fit. There are times when I will want more orange and yellow shades in my fire and I won't use any red at all. There are other times where I want more of an orange look to the fire, so I will use reds and oranges and little if any yellow. It's completely up to you. In this video, I'm going to show you the complete spectrum. I will be using red, orange, and yellows. I use Createx paint pretty much exclusively and have for the last 14 or 15 years now. So with the exception of my final top coat clear, everything else I use is water-based Createx products, whether it's the Illustration line or the Wicked line. They're both intermixable and they work well separate or together, it doesn't matter. For the longest time, the biggest issue I had with the Createx line of products was pretty much everything they offered was a transparent or acted like a transparent. They did have some semi-opaques in the Auto Air line, but those were still very transparent in nature. They didn't have the covering ability of a true opaque paint. When they came out with the opaque colors in both the Illustration and the Wicked line, that was a complete game changer as far as creating fire is concerned. So we have 2 choices of reds for our fire. There is the Illustration opaque red and the Wicked opaque pyro red. You might be wondering, why do I have 2 of the same shades of red under different brand names. They're not actually the exact same shade of red. They are different, and red, being a primary color, is not something you can just mix up when you need some. So I like to have options when I have them available. You can choose whichever one you wish to use for your fire. And you can absolutely reduce it and spray it directly out of the bottle if you choose to do so. I personally do not do that. Here's why. When we're painting or creating fire in a painting, I want the fire to be bright, vibrant, glowing. That's what fire is. It's glowing light. I want to capture that in the painting as well. Remember, especially when you're using candies, candies will always darken whatever you're spraying the candies over. Personally, both of these shades of red are a little bit too dark for my personal taste for painting fire. There are times when maybe I want the red layer to be pushed further back in the background and I can go ahead and use it straight out of the bottle. Most of the time I don't. If these are too dark coming straight out of the bottle, now imagine spraying a blood red Candy 2.0 over this layer, which is going to darken it further. I'm not going to be spraying blood red candy over the red in this particular video, but that's something to think about when you're creating your own fire. As I said, this is a little bit dark for my taste, so I choose to brighten it up just a little bit, and I do that by mixing it with Wicked Opaque Bismuth Vanadate Yellow. It's a 70-30 mix, so I use 70% of the Pyrrole Red and 30% of the Bismuth Vanadate Yellow, or 7-3, 7 parts red to 3 parts yellow. Once I've got that mixed up, then I will add reducer to a 3-to-1 mix. So I have 3 parts paint to 1 part 4011 reducer. If you follow my channel, you're probably aware that that is a little bit thicker. Actually, it's quite a bit thicker than what I normally choose to work with. I'm normally closer to a 1-to-1 ratio. The reason behind less reducer with the opaque colors is because I want the coverage. If you over reduce your opaque paints, you are reducing the opacity of that paint because you're thinning out the pigment and the binder in the paint itself. It's still going to cover, but you're going to have to make more passes to get the coverage. I want the coverage quick, fast, and in a hurry. So I choose to reduce these paints for this purpose at a 3-to-1 ratio. At times that's a little bit too thick and my airbrush doesn't exactly like it. You can reduce it more, but understand that with more reduction, you're going to change the opacity properties of the paint. So I'm sticking with a 3-to-1 mixture with the opaque paints. So let's get started on the red, the first initial layer on this table. So for this first color with our red mix, I want to start building the background layer of flames into this image. For that, I'm primarily going to be working freehand. I may use a shield here or there. Primarily, I will be using a shield just to mask some of these areas off where I don't necessarily want to cover the artwork that I've already covered. For example, the tanks on the backs, I would like to keep those separate from the fire so I can use the bird shield to mask and protect those areas, because this first layer of the red on the top half of this particular table is pretty much going to be filled in here. I'll do some free licks, but for the most part, I'm basically just going to fill this area in, and then our oranges and yellows will build the real body of the fire So this is very loose. Building the color up to make sure it shows up. Start getting some of this red around the actual firefighter, and I'm okay if this color overlaps some of the artwork that I've already completed, but I'd like to keep a lot of it still visible. Make sure you dry your paint. I'm putting this on relatively heavily at this point. So before you lay a freehand shield back onto the surface, you want to make sure that the paint is dry. When I say I'm going to fill this entire area in, I don't necessarily mean I'm going to completely just cover this with red paint. I still want to leave some voids and some fire-looking shapes in the design. See what I just did there? The negative space, using the freehand shield, just to find the backside of his helmet with the red, which had kind of gotten lost with the sepia. Hopefully you can see this is very loose. I'm not really thinking a lot about what I'm doing before I'm actually spraying paint onto the surface. I'm just kind of letting my imagination take me wherever that might be. Really laying this color on heavily. This isn't opaque, it will cover, and it covers pretty quickly, as you can see. Just want to make sure it's good and bright so that it shows up, because once we start going over this with the oranges and the yellows, it's going to push the red back farther and it won't be quite as noticeable in most of these areas. Working tighter and a little bit slower as I get up here around his head so that I don't cover up. everything that I've already done before this stage. My initial idea was to more or less have the firefighters as more of a silhouette than what it turned out. I tend to work off the cuff a lot. I'll have a basic idea for what I want to do in the beginning, but it often changes once I actually start putting paint down, and that's kind of what happened here. I decided that rather than having a full silhouette, I thought it might look better if I actually had a little more detail in the actual firefighters. In this particular case, I'm okay with some of the overspray bleeding into what I've already painted, because realistically, if there was really this much fire around these firefighters and this logo, then that would be lighting everything up as well. So I don't want to get too carried away and really make a lot of secondary lighting sources in this particular painting. But allowing a little bit of it to bleed into other areas of the painting will help, and I'll highlight some of these areas with the brighter colors, the oranges and the yellows, as we progress. Hopefully you can see how bright that red is next to all the work that I'd already done before. My process is I sort of just start sketching lines into what I'm working on with the actual paint and see what I like and what I don't like. And when I see something I like, I can start adding to it. If there's something in here that I don't like, then it's not terribly difficult to erase it, simply by painting over it with the red is what I mean when I say erase it. Couple of things to mention here. I said in that portion of the video, while I was actively painting the initial layer of fire, that I don't really think about what I'm actually doing. I just kind of let my imagination take me where it's going to take me. I have preached and preached and preached to all of you to use photographic references when you are trying to recreate fire, and I stand by that. However, to be completely honest with all of you, I wasn't using a photographic reference on this particular table. Once you've done a lot of these, you'll get an idea for how things flow and what looks good and what doesn't, and then you can kind of make it up as you go. I find when I think less about what I'm actually trying to paint, I get a better result compared to when I really analyze what I'm doing, because then I wind up with more of a contrived look that loses some of that realism in the end product. So use a reference photograph or several reference photographs when you are new to this. Once you've done a lot of these, like I said, you will figure out how things are patterned and what looks good and go from there. But when you're starting, I do highly recommend that you use a photographic reference. Hopefully you could see how nicely that opaque paint covers really fast. I was laying it on pretty thick most of the time. You can see in the video how wet the paint was. It still dries relatively quickly, and the coverage is absolutely amazing compared to just a few years ago with the Createx product. So I'm very happy with the opaque colors. This is what the table looks like after that initial stage, and hopefully you can kind of see where I was going with all of this, how the fire is coming off of the firefighters and coming into that sort of central location. That's the look I was more or less going for. There are some inclusions in this initial layer of flames. You can still see some of the sepia, not a lot, but you can still see some of the sepia behind all of this red. And I didn't use any freehand shields or stencils to create the initial base or background layer of fire. I'm not saying you cannot use freehand shields when you're creating your initial layer of fire. You absolutely can. You just want to use them sparingly. And you'll see as we progress that I actually use very few freehand shields in my fire nowadays. I prefer a lot more of a freehand approach when it comes to rendering fire. The next step in the process is to create some orange shades as the next layer of our fire, and there are a number of ways you could go about doing that. You could choose to use an opaque yellow paint and then come over the top of that with Candy Grabber Orange. I'm not a huge fan of that method for a couple of reasons. The first reason on this particular job is what we talked about previously. I don't want to use a lot of dark candies on this fire because I'll wind up with a halo around the fire on the lower half of the table surrounding the logo. The other thing is I find the Candy 2.0 candies are a little bit darker than I would prefer when it comes to painting or creating the illusion of realistic fire in a painting as well. Grabber Orange is a pretty dark color. There are ways you can mitigate that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I have found that I prefer most of the time to just go in with an opaque orange paint to create my orange layer. That's exactly what I did on this table. When it comes to your choices of the opaque oranges, again, we have two to choose from. We have Illustration Opaque Orange, and there is the Wicked Pyro Opaque Orange. Once again, you could easily reduce either one of these colors and spray them straight out of the bottle. I, again, choose not to do that. Both of these colors are a little too dark for my taste when it comes to creating fire. The Pyro Orange is a pretty bright orange. It's a nice color. It would work really well, but it's still a little bit too dark. I actually prefer the Illustration Opaque Orange for the orange layer in my fire. But this is still a little bit too dark, especially if you're going to go over the top of it with a candy orange or even a candy yellow after the fact, because that is going to push it back, make it a little bit darker. So I prefer to mix my illustration opaque orange 1-to-1 with the Wicked Bismuth Vanadate opaque yellow. Again, once I've mixed those two colors together, I reduce that at about a 3-to-1 ratio. 3 parts paint to 1 part 4011 reducer, because that retains the opacity, the covering quality of the paint that I want when I'm creating fire. This is the point where I'm going to begin using my freehand shields as well. I chose to use the Mike LaValle shields because they're great for this purpose. That's what he designed them for. And I have the entire set, both the small, the medium, and the large. I've got all of the shields that I used on this table put up behind me. So in total, I only used 7 of the shields out of the entire set. Remember to use your shields sparingly. There's nothing wrong with using your shields, but you don't want to just lay the shield down and constantly create super sharp curved edges. You'll see some of these have more paint on them compared to the others because I use them more. The smaller ones were used primarily on the lower half around the logo. The larger ones were used up above in between the firefighters. I don't want to go in with the orange and cover all of the red. I still want a lot of the red to show through in the end. Remember your flow and changing directions. I want to start creating different licks, traveling in different directions as I continue building layers. If you go in and try to recreate the same lick with each color reseeding your layers, it's going to look very contrived in the end. You want a natural, more organic feel, if that makes sense, when you're creating fire. So I'm still reseeding my layers. I'm not going to take the oranges past the red. It will be contained within what I've already created, but I want to form new flows, new directions of flow with some of these licks. So let's go to the table. I've already worked on some of the lower half of this table. I've also come in and added just a little bit of both the red and this orange into the jacket of each firefighter, just to try to start tying all of this together. So at this stage, I will continue doing what we started previously. Essentially just sketching out kind of how I envision this flowing together. This is also the stage where I will begin using some freehand shields to get some of these more defined shapes. still very loose for the most part. Trying to build a little bit of a glow right around the top of this oxygen tank. Building shapes. Slowly, although this is an opaque color, it still takes a little more effort to get the coverage with this orange mix compared to the red. If you need to increase the brightness in one area, You can always come back over it a little bit later once the initial layers had some time to dry. Hint of this orange to that line on the helmet. Building this up slowly, I'm applying some paint and then using air to dry it before applying some more paint, which also helps to build the opacity. Work on connecting this lick here with some of what I've already got going on the lower end. Remember, these don't have to physically connect. It actually looks better, in my opinion, when you have some areas that are just open within your fire where it looks like that's probably connecting, but it's not an actual physical connection. Carry this one up into what we already had established with the red. It's a very thin line. Hopefully you can see that although I am using some freehand shields to define and sharpen up some of these shapes, the majority of what I'm doing is still mostly freehand. And I'm just trying to build a flow in this fire to make it look somewhat believable. It doesn't have to be perfect. probably not going to be perfect. The basic idea for me is to just start kind of playing with different shapes and things by creating these little lines. Like maybe there's some fire swooping off the back of that tank. And once I get that basic idea down with or from creating just a few of these little lines, then I can start adding to it, building off of it. And just see where it takes me. I am terrible at trying to explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it while I'm actually working, and I apologize for that. But let's talk about what we just watched. One thing you may have noticed is the shade of orange that I was using for this layer of fire is pretty pale. It's a pretty light shade of orange, and again, that's what I wanted to begin with. I didn't want to use a darker color because I knew I would be going over this with a candy later. So we will address that in the end. That color will not only darken up slightly, but it's also going to brighten up considerably once the candy goes on. I was using my freehand shields not only to create some of the licks of fire, but I probably used them more in order to mask areas that I wanted to protect from the orange paint. I use them sparingly as far as creating the licks of fire goes. Sometimes I will use a shield to create a nice crisp edge, and then I'll immediately go back over that with some freehand strokes to soften that up. I really prefer the softer feel when it comes to fire. I've migrated more toward a lot more freehand use compared to shield use. There's nothing wrong with using the shields and leaving a sharp edge there. Just remember to use them sparingly. You need a balance of both techniques in order to really pull off that organic, realistic feel. I don't always know which shape on a shield I'm going to use. I'm kind of letting my imagination take me where it's going to take me when it comes to creating the body and the flow of this fire. You saw several times I'll pick up a shield and look at it and then put it down, maybe pick up another shield and look at that. At one point, I eventually couldn't find a shape that I was happy with, so I just went in and created a line there freehand. Here's what it looks like with the complete orange layer finished. Again, you can still see a lot of the red behind the orange layer. You have to think about the hotter spots of the fire. I wanted it to be a little bit hotter coming off of the firefighter's head, and that's why I brought in some more orange behind those areas. I didn't cover all of the red completely, but it's got quite a bit of orange in that area. I talked about reseeding your paint layers. So I kept everything with the orange paint within the boundaries of the red paint that I had previously applied, and that will carry on as we move forward. All the remaining layers will remain within the boundaries of that red layer. It's also important to reseed your paint application, meaning there is less orange paint applied to the table at this point than there was red. At the same time, the next step with the yellow, there will be less yellow paint than there was orange. So this was looking pretty good at this point. There are some areas that I really like, and there are some areas that I'm not crazy about, but we can address those areas when we create the next layer, which is going to be the yellow. Moving on to the yellow layer of our fire. Createx offers a few more choices when it comes to opaque yellows. We have the Illustration Opaque Chrome Yellow, we have Illustration Opaque Yellow, there is Wicked Opaque Bismuth Vanadate Yellow, and there's also a Wicked Opaque Hansa Yellow. The same rules apply for these colors as what we previously talked about. You can absolutely reduce these and spray them straight out of the bottle if you choose to do so. There are some good choices. The Illustration Opaque Chrome Yellow is a really good color. It's a very warm yellow. I like it a lot. In fact, it really reminds me of the House of Color Chrome Yellow. I think the two are very similar if memory serves, but I haven't used House of Color in 14 or 15 years now. That is actually the color I used for the border surrounding the logo on the table. I have used the Illustration Chrome Yellow in some of my fire previously with mixed results. Again, I really like the color on its own. I think it's awesome. The problem I have noticed is the Candy 2.0 line of colors that we have to choose from seem to be a little bit darker shades of candy compared to the solvent-based candies that I used years ago. So once you cover the Illustration Opaque Chrome Yellow with a Candy 2.0, it tends to get it a little bit darker than what I personally prefer. Just something to keep in mind. I also want to use a different shade of yellow because I already have Chrome Yellow on this table. If I were to use the same yellow for the fire, it's just going to blend into that border, and I want the fire to be separate from the border. So I went with a different choice on this table. The Wicked Hansa Yellow is not a bad choice because this is a warm shade of yellow to begin with, which is ideally what you want when you are painting a subject like fire. I ultimately decided to go with one of the cooler shades. The Illustration Opaque Yellow and the Wicked Bismuth Vanadate Yellow are both cooler shades of yellow, meaning they lean more toward the green side of the color wheel versus the red side of the color wheel. I'd already mixed the Bismuth Vanadate Yellow with the previous colors we used, the orange and the red. So I decided to go ahead and stick with this shade of yellow. Although this is a cooler yellow, we can change that to some degree by tinting it with candies later. So I'm not concerned that this is a cooler shade of yellow. It may look funny initially when we're spraying it onto the surface, but we can alter that at the end. As I said before, I'm not crazy about spraying this color straight out of the bottle because it's a little bit too dark once the candies start going over it. So I cut it 1-to-1 with Wicked Opaque White. So there's 1 part Bismuth Vanadate Yellow and 1 part Wicked Opaque White. Once those are mixed together, again, I stuck with the 3-to-1 reduction ratio. 3 parts paint to 1 part 4011 reducer. I allowed that to sit for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I started to spray the yellow layer. When it comes to this portion of the airbrushing session, I'm not necessarily looking to create a lot of new flame licks. I may create some very small licks that didn't exist in the orange area. I will especially do that in areas that I want to change something or cover something up that I don't really like that I created in one of the previous layers. You will see that in a few minutes. But for the most part, Remember the receding layers. I will use a lot less of this color compared to the orange and definitely compared to the red. So we've talked about receding our paint layers. As you can see, once again, I've already painted this yellow on the bottom half of this particular project. Receding your paint layers is more important when you get to these final stages because we're using this yellow to develop the hottest portions of the fire. Less is more. I don't want to overpower everything that we've already done with this yellow. I want to still be able to see some of the reds and the oranges within this fire. So I'm going to work on building on what I already have as opposed to creating a lot of new flame licks in this piece. The process here is very similar to what I've done previously. I will normally come in and create some thin sketched lines with the airbrush in order to kind of figure out what I want to do. Once I have an idea of what I want to do, then I can start coming in and reinforcing, refining, however you want to say it, what I have there. Use of the freehand shields becomes a little more important at this stage as well, because this is the point I'm really beginning to tighten things up. The yellow flame licks are a little bit tighter, a little more crisp compared to a lot of what we've already painted. There are some crisp flame licks in the previous layers, but I used the shields relatively sparingly. Now I will use them a little more often, still not all over the place. I don't want to just start using a shield to create every flame lick. You still want those freehand strokes. That's what really brings this stuff to life, in my opinion, and sells the realism. So I'll use some freehand strokes in conjunction with the shields, and notice I left the center of that particular flame lick relatively translucent. You can still see the layers behind it, and that's important to really sell the depth. It's good to have some opaque areas as well that you can't necessarily see through. You want a mix of all of these techniques. This little section, for example, this flame lick, the body of it was already established in the previous step. Now I'm reseeding the layer, so I'm adding a brighter hot spot within what was already created, but you can still see the outer boundaries, if you will, of what was created previously. I like to just create some lines, allowing them to fade in and out on both ends, and that just brings a little bit of realism to it, I think. Add a little bit of this to the back side of the helmet. Along with that line going around it, just like there's a little bit of a glow behind the helmet. And some little hot spots off by themselves. Same thing here, but again, I'm still receding. I don't want to just completely cover what I had painted before. I can still see the orange behind that yellow, and then there's red behind that. Same thing here, we'll add a little bit of a hot spot. Airbrush is not wanting to spray correctly. This paint is a little bit thick at 3:1 because I want the coverage quickly. So sometimes you just have to deal with it. I'll begin filling some of this in, but not just solid. I'm going to leave some lines in here, very similar to what I did right there. Or at least a little bit of a fade, so you can still see some of that orange color behind. I think it needs a little bit of a hot spot in this orange spot here, so again, just a little bit. Sometimes just a slight little line is all you need so that we can still see the orange and then the red behind that. This line needs to be cleaned up a little bit, make it a little bit sharper. probably have a highlight on these tanks, just a little bit of this brighter color. Use the shield to mask off the strap. Maybe reinforce the highlight in the actual hose, which I used some drywall tape when I did this. So I can set the drywall tape directly on the surface and give myself a nice little highlight on the hose. With just a hint of texture. While I was spraying the reds and the oranges, I was adding just a hint of those colors into the coats of the firefighters, and I didn't show any of that on camera. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of this opaque yellow into this as well, just for those secondary lighting sources. I want to get carried away and get too much in here. I just want a little bit. This is looking pretty good. I think I'll come up and put a little bit of a brighter hot spot in this slick here. Maybe a little bit of a line right in there, which makes it look like maybe this lick could be connecting with that one. Maybe a little bit more of a hot spot down in this corner. Paint is maybe a little bit too thick, what I'm actually trying to do. I want to remember that these are the hot spots. Generally speaking, the hottest part of the fire is going to be at the source of the fire, which is down low on this particular piece. I don't want to add too much of this yellow at the very top. I want some to sell the idea of fire, but I also want to be careful about putting too much. So this is looking good with what I have. I probably don't want to spend a lot more time up in here adding more and more of this color. One thing we can talk about quickly is sometimes you'll wind up with a fire lick in your fire that you don't necessarily like, or you're not exactly happy with it. It's easier to do that, in my opinion, when you are trying to make all of this up out of your head, just like I am right now. I still stand by the fact that you should use a photographic reference when you're painting fire, unless you've done a lot of this stuff. And this can happen even when you're using photographic references, meaning you can wind up with a flame lick that you're not crazy about or just doesn't look like it's right compared to the rest of your work. For example, this little section right here, I'm not real crazy about that little section. I wasn't crazy about it when I had the red lick going over that part, so I came over that with the orange and tried to not necessarily hide what I didn't like, because you can still see some translucency through that section, but I tried to cover it somewhat, disguise it to make it look a little bit different. I'm still not crazy about this particular flame lick. So the great thing about working in layers like this is I can still come back in and change this to some degree with the yellow. And that's what I'm going to do right now. So I like this section right here. I think I'm going to build on that, and that flows with what we already have going on around that part too. So once again, come in, and sketch out a line, see how I feel about that. Another line. That's not bad, so I can add some freehand strokes here. That's not bad. I still need to do something with this little section here. I might just put a bright little use a little bit of a shield on the inner edge. I already like that a little bit better. You can still see the red and the orange portion that I didn't like before behind that, but I can mask. And what I mean by what I don't like is how the red section is curving around there and then going straight up. I don't mind the red being behind there, but I want to hide that little section where it's pretty much just going horizontally. So once again, I can come in and add some more to this particular flame lick. Just doing dagger strokes. And fading them up in that direction. So the red's still there, and so is that horizontal plane, but now it's a little bit more hidden. You can still see through it, and that's what I want, is that transparency. But it looks a lot better this way than it did just a few minutes ago. So the yellow stage is really more about enhancing what we already created rather than continuing to add more to the fire. I want to keep it simple. I don't want to overcomplicate it, because if I add too much, I think it would detract from the rest of the artwork in the piece. Here's what it looked like once the yellow stage was finished. And you can also see that the yellow really bumps up the contrast, especially in the area of the firefighters' heads and their helmets. Those really stand out a lot more with that yellow interjected into the piece compared to what it did previously. You can also see around the border on the logo, the fire that we created with our yellow mixture. Even though that's a different shade of yellow than what was used for the actual border, they still sort of blend together relatively well. It's hard to differentiate where the border starts and where the fire starts in some of those areas, and that's not necessarily the look that I was going for. We will address that in the next stage. And the next stage is the last opaque color that I will be spraying for our fire, and it's essentially Wicked Opaque White. You can use Wicked Opaque White only for this. I choose to mix up my Wicked Opaque White, same reduction ratio, 3:1, 3 parts Wicked Opaque White to 1 part 4011 reducer, and then I will add 1 or 2 drops of the Wicked Opaque Bismuth Vanadate Yellow into my airbrush cup. I'll back flush the airbrush in order to mix that up, and then I can go in and really create the hottest spots, the brightest highlights in all of the fire. Same principle as what we used when we were spraying the yellow. I'm not trying to add anything new at this point. I am just going in and enhancing what we just did with the yellow a little bit more with this really bright white mixture. With respect to the hot spots or the highlights in our fire, I want to continue with the same approach we've been using up to this point as far as reseeding our layers goes, but I'm going to add to that. For the brightest, hottest spots in this fire, I want to keep those within what I've already created with the yellow. I don't want to branch out and develop new areas in what we've already created. But you also have to keep in mind that the brightest spots, the hottest spots in fire generally originates from the base of the fire or where the fire is originating from. So as I come up, I will add fewer hot spots near the top of this artwork compared to what I might have down lower. It's still a less is more approach. I don't want to get carried away with this. I also find that I generally prefer to stick with pretty much just freehand when it comes to creating these final hot spots or highlights in my fire. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. If you choose to use your freehand shields, that works as well. But I use less and less freehand shield work in my fire nowadays. I really like the freehand look, the freehand lines, the fades, the blends that you get just working freehand compared to putting a lot of freehand shield work into the fire. It looks good to have some sharp lines in here that you create with your freehand shields. You can't create a line that sharp with the airbrush alone. Just remember, less is more. You want to keep a balance, and I really prefer less nowadays compared to what I used to. So I've already worked on some of the lower end of this project, once again off camera, and now I'm going to start bringing some of these hot spots up. Very minimalistic. I'll want something here, probably just a few lines on that outer left edge. We can fade that in somewhat, and that's really all I need for that particular spot. Maybe a little bit in here. Same thing on this one. just a few lines along with a little bit of a blend. Again, the receding layers, I'm keeping these hot spots within the yellow that I've already painted previously. I'm not bringing this out into the oranges and the reds. For this little spot here, maybe just a few lines at the very base of that little lick. Bring some of this up behind the actual firefighter. Very minimal. Grab a shield just to protect the helmet, so I can get that hot spot right up to the base of it. This yellow lick right here looks relatively hot compared to everything around it. I might add just a hint of white down here in this corner where I got a little bit heavy with that yellow. Same thing in this corner. Just a couple very short, small lines. Like this section here, probably have some heat coming off of that oxygen tank. Maybe a little bit on this slick here. Again, this paint is mixed about 3-to-1, so it's a little bit thick for the air pressure that I'm working at. Hopefully you get the idea. And here's what it looks like at this point. Again, very minimalistic. The goal at this stage is to punch out the brightest, hottest spots in the fire, but remember the less is more mantra. It definitely comes into play at this stage of the game. The other thing that this very pale yellow color allowed me to do, and it is pale yellow, it looks white in contrast to all of the other colors surrounding it, but with the 1 or 2 drops of yellow added to the white, it is a very pale yellow, which takes away a little bit of the blue shift. The other thing this color allowed me to do was really separate the fire from the border surrounding the logo. The final step in the process is to add the candy layer. I am only using 1 layer of candy, and I'm only using 1 color of candy. That's a candy yellow. When it comes to the color choices in candies, we have 2 choices as far as yellow is concerned in the Candy 2.0 line. We have tequila yellow and we have lemon yellow. Lemon yellow is a cooler shade of yellow. It's more on the green side of the color wheel. Tequila yellow is a warm shade of yellow. It's more toward the orange and the red side of the color wheel. I definitely want a warmer candy to go over this fire. However, I found that the tequila yellow is quite a bit darker than what I prefer when it comes to fire. So what I've wound up doing is I mix these 1-to-1. 1 part lemon yellow candy to 1 part tequila yellow candy, which still yields a warm shade of yellow candy, but it's not nearly as dark as it would be if I was only using tequila candy. So I'll mix those together very well with a stir stick, and then I will add the carrier, which is UVLS Gloss Clear, the 4050. When I am doing this on fire, I mix a very weak mixture of candy. So I mix it 5-to-1. I have 5 parts UVLS Gloss Clear to 1 part of my lemon yellow, tequila yellow mix. Stir those up very well before you add any reducer. You may not need any reducer to spray this stuff because it's relatively thin. It's a little bit thicker when you're using a 5-to-1 ratio with the UVLS, but I often add a splash of 4011 reducer once the candy and the UVLS have been mixed. If you've watched any of my other Candy 2.0 videos, you're probably aware that normally when I'm using candies to create actual artwork, I'm generally spraying them at a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 part UVLS gloss to 1 part candy, and then reduce it from there if needed. There is a very specific reason why I mixed this candy thin, meaning using the 5 parts of UVLS clear to the 1 part of candy. I don't want a super strong candy mix because I'm going to use this candy to go over our brightest, hottest spots, the highlights, if you will, of this fire, but I want to sneak up on it. If you mix your candy very strong, say a 1-to-1, you're going to turn that white color or pale yellow color into almost the same color as the other yellow that's already been established, and you'll lose your highlights really quickly. Using this very light mix of a candy, I can put a very light layer of candy over that, and it tints the white more to a yellow. It's not near as bright as it was before I applied the candy, but I haven't lost the highlight either. You can also use this candy to spray over the fire that we've already created, and you can see how it intensifies that yellow that was already there. Yellow is really more of a pale color without the candy over the top of it. For example, this little lick right here. It's still bright, but it's not as intense as it is compared to spraying a little bit of this candy color over that yellow. Now it's even brighter than it was before. That's what candies do for you. It intensifies the colors underneath because these are a true transparent dye. So I can use a very light layer of candy over not only the highlights, but everything else that I've already painted. The other thing that this very light mix of candy does is when you get to areas where you're going to overlap other artwork or even the background of the table. For one, with the background of the table, you want to get in close and be very strategic where you're applying the candy. In areas like this, where this oxygen tank is, I can get up next to it, and if there's a little bit of candy that gets onto that, it's not a huge deal. It's not going to be noticeable. Go over the highlights on that tank just a little bit with this candy. Again, just to kind of tint those more to a yellow versus that what appears white on here color. This is the step, I think, that really brings all this to life. It makes it glow, it makes it look more realistic, and I can even bring a little bit of this candy over the highlights and the shadows on the jacket, just to push these colors into that yellow spectrum. Still being very light with the application. There you can see, hopefully the camera's picking it up, you can still see the differentiation. You can still see that super hot spot we created with that very pale yellow color, but now it blends more into the rest of the fire. Being careful as I come up higher and get away from the flames and into that sepia color. You don't have to take the candy all the way to the end of every flame lick. You can blend it out gradually as you move upward. So in conclusion, that was one method you could use to render fire in your own artwork. I think I covered everything pretty well. If you have questions, leave them in the comments below and I will answer them as I can. I was pretty happy with the results. Here's what it looked like finished. And again, this is a method. I'm not saying it's the method. There's a number of different ways you could approach painting the same subject, but this is one method that I've found that works really good and yields nice results. So I hope all of that made sense. I hope you guys got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I will leave links to all of the products that I used in the description below. They are affiliate links, so if you choose to make a purchase through one of those links, I do get a very small portion of that sale at no extra cost to you, which helps to support the channel, and I greatly appreciate that. Until next time, I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I'll see you guys then.